The inspection line at the Anvil Proving Grounds was called a courtesy. Sloane Duran had learned, in 3 years of wearing Concord auxiliary gray, that courtesy was the word the directorate used right before it took something from you. She stood at parade rest on the firing apron with 11 other members of the Saul Marksman Detachment, rifle laid flat across her forearms the way regulation demanded, and watched Under-Marshal Ossen Thale walk the line like a man counting inventory he already considered surplus. Behind him, on the observation tier, 40 officers from a dozen Concord member worlds watched through the heat shimmer coming off the range floor. Above all of them, in the marshal's box, Grand Marshal Vesa Ilkar stood with her hands folded behind her back, and her spinal crest lying flat and unreadable against her collar. Thale reached Sloane last. That was not an accident. Nothing Thale did was an accident. He looked at her rifle the way a man looks at a stain he intends to have removed. It was a long gun, dark walnut stock gone silver-gray at the grip where 3 generations of hands had worn the finish thin, a bolt action worked by hand, a scope with no readout, no uplink, no processor of any kind behind the glass. Thale lifted it off her arms with 2 fingers, as if it might leave residue. Corporal Duran. His voice carried the Thren double tone, 2 registers a half step apart that made every sentence sound faintly like a chord. This is the weapon you intend to carry into the next assessment cycle. Yes, Under-Marshal. It has no targeting mesh, no adaptive choke, no interdiction handshake. He turned it over, found the tiny brass plate set into the stock, the one that read Meridian Line, 3 RD Recon in letters worn almost smooth. It predates your species' unification war by a generation. It predates the Concord's admission of your species by 130 years. He set it back across her arms, harder than he needed to. Your rifle is obsolete. Nobody on the observation tier laughed, because laughing at a formal review was against protocol, but she heard the crest flare ripple down the line like wind through wheat, the small Thren tell for amusement they thought they were too disciplined to show. Ilkar's crest did not move at all. The legacy arms exemption expires with this assessment cycle, Thale went on, pitching his voice for the tier now, not for her. Every human auxiliary unit will rearm with standard Concord ordnance by the new year. I intend to demonstrate why that transition is overdue. He gestured, and 2 directorate technicians wheeled a reactive target frame onto the range floor, a squat drone housing wrapped in a faint blue shimmer that bent the desert light around it like heat off asphalt. This is the interdiction veil the Concord has fielded on every combat platform for 40 years. It has never been penetrated by a projectile weapon in a sanctioned trial. Not once. He looked at her rifle again, and this time he did smile. Corporal, you may fire the honor round, if the panel permits. It was meant as a mercy stroke. Let the human embarrass herself with her museum piece, and the exemption dies quietly, on schedule, with no one having to argue the point in committee. Sloane understood the shape of it the moment he said it, understood it the way she understood wind drift and bore diameter, as a fact of the terrain she now had to solve. She looked up at the marshal's box. Ilkar's stare came back level, unreadable, granting nothing but the bare permission protocol required. I'll take the shot, Sloane said. She had grown up on a farm outside a town that didn't exist anymore, in a house that had belonged to a grandmother she'd never met. Marisol Duran had died 14 years before Sloane was born, in the last month of the Meridian Line War, on a ridge that took her unit's position and gave the retreating column 6 hours it needed to survive. The rifle came home in a case with her medals and a field journal half burned at the edges, and Sloane's mother kept it oiled and locked in a closet for 30 years out of a grief she never once explained, until Sloane was 12 and asked to hold it, and something in the weight of it, not the metal, the weight of who had carried it, settled into her hands like it had been waiting. She had not touched a Concord-issue rifle, without also carrying the Meridian gun since she was 17. When the Concord came to Earth and offered auxiliary status instead of protectorate status, on the condition every serving unit re-equip with standard ordnance, Human Command had fought for one carve-out and won it. Units that could prove combat proficiency with heritage arms could retain them under the legacy arms exemption. A grandfather clause nobody in the Directorate had expected to survive a decade. It had survived 11 years. Thale intended it not to survive an afternoon more. Sloane had joined the Saul Marksman Detachment at 19. 3 years after the Concord's arrival, split her family the ordinary quiet way most families got split by history. Her older brother into orbital infrastructure work that kept him well clear of anything resembling a uniform. Her mother into a bitter, permanent skepticism of anything with a Thren crest on the letterhead, and Sloane herself into the recruiting office in the nearest surviving town. Carrying a rifle case, she had no intention of leaving behind no matter what the enlistment officer told her about standard issue equipment. She had expected to be told no. She had not expected Chief Gunnery Sergeant Emery Falk, who ran the detachment's armory in those early years the way some men run a church, to take one look at the Meridian Rifle's action, ask her 3 questions about bore maintenance she answered correctly without hesitation, and quietly file the paperwork that got her marksmanship qualified on heritage arms before anyone above his pay grade thought to object. The legacy arms exemption had been, in those first years, less a policy than an argument nobody had finished having. A single clause buried in the annexation treaty that Concord procurement kept trying to sunset, and Human Command kept finding some new technicality to defend. Because, for reasons neither side ever stated plainly in the negotiating room, both understood it stood for something larger than the rifles themselves. To the Directorate, it was an untidy exception to a fleet that prized uniformity. To the handful of human detachments who still trained on it, it was the last thing about their service that had not been handed to them fully formed by somebody else's 4-decade-old doctrine. The one discipline in the whole auxiliary corps where a farm girl from a town that didn't exist anymore could outshoot officers who'd trained since childhood on equipment that did half the thinking for them, because the rifle in her hands had never once done any of the thinking for her. Sloane settled into the prone position on the firing line, boots splayed, cheek finding the stock the way it always found the stock, without her having to think about the geometry of it. The target sat at 400 meters, close enough that Thale expected a fast, clean, humiliating miss. The blue shimmer of the interdiction veil pulsed once as the drone systems armed. Any munition the veil has ever seen, it predicts, Thale said for the tier's benefit for the record. Guided rounds broadcast a terminal correction signature the instant they arm. Directed energy weapons broadcast a charge signature the instant they discharge. The veil reads the signature, calculates the intercept vector, and answers before the round arrives. It is not armor, it is prophecy. He folded his hands. Your weapon will need to defeat physics that have not lost a sanctioned engagement in 40 years. Sloane did not answer him. She was not aiming at Thale's physics. She was aiming at 400 meters of still desert air, reading the faint left-to-right shimmer of a crosswind off the northern ridge, feeling for the half-breath pause her grandmother's journal called the held moment. The space between one heartbeat and the next where the whole body goes still enough that the rifle stops being a separate thing from the person holding it. She fired. The report cracked flat across the range. No whine of a coil charging, no hiss of a directed beam, nothing for the veil's sensors to taste before the round was already most of the way there. The drone's shimmer flexed once, the interdiction field trying, a fraction of a second too late, to read a signature that had never existed in the first place, because a spinning lump of tungsten alloy on a purely ballistic arc doesn't announce itself to anything. It doesn't correct. It doesn't broadcast. It just goes where the math already said it would go. The round went through the veil as though the veil were painted on glass. The drone housing behind it took the impact dead center and folded inward with a bang of ruptured casing. And for 3 full seconds the only sound on the anvil proving grounds was the wind. Sloane worked the bolt out of long habit, chambered nothing, and came up off the prone position to stand at attention, because standing at attention was the only thing she trusted her face to do right in front of 40 officers and a Grand Marshal. On the observation tier, the crest flare that ran down the line this time had nothing to do with amusement. Thren's spinal quills rose when adrenaline spiked, an old predator response nobody had managed to breed out of them in 10,000 years of civilization, and 40 crests came up at once like a field of grass in a gust of wind. Vesa Ilkar's crest rose too. Just once, just barely, and then she made it lie flat again through what looked, even from 400 meters, like an act of considerable will. Thales did not move at all, and Sloane understood, watching him, that this was the most dangerous thing about him. He had learned to keep it still. "Sabotage," he said, and his voice did not shake, which she respected even as she watched him build the lie in real time. "The Vale unit is Directorate property. It will be recovered and inspected for tampering before this trial is entered into any record." "Under-Marshal." Ilkar's voice came down from the box, flat, formal, the double tone smoothed into a single register the way it went when a Thren wanted a room to understand she was speaking as an office and not as a person. "The unit will be recovered and inspected." "Agreed." "And Corporal Duran's detachment will not be reassigned to standard ordnance pending that inspection." It was not a victory. Sloane understood that too, standing there with the rifle warm against her palms and 40 crests still half raised around her. It was a stay of execution, granted by a woman who had not decided anything yet, except that she did not like being handed a conclusion before she'd seen the evidence herself. Thale's mouth thinned into something that was almost a smile again, and Sloane recognized the shape of it. He had already decided what the inspection would find. He was not wrong to be confident. He controlled the inspection. He did not wait for that inspection to run its course before trying to end the argument outright. By the following morning, a revised trial order had circulated through the Anvil Proving Grounds Review Board under Thale's own procedural authority. A second sanctioned demonstration, this one designed, in his words, to remove ambiguity from the record. The range was reconfigured before Sloane arrived. The reactive target moved back from 400 meters to 900, mounted on a lateral rail that would carry it through an unpredictable traverse the instant the trial was called, and ringed with a cluster of decoy emitters built to broadcast false guidance signatures into the air around it. On the theory, Thale explained to the assembled panel that if the first shot's success had been some fluke of an unusually clean firing solution, a target moving through a field of confusing emissions would expose it. If Corporal Duran's weapon is genuinely undetectable to interdiction sensors, he said, then a cluttered signature environment should make no difference at all. If it is not, if the first result depended on conditions that will not exist in an actual engagement, then this will show it. It was, Sloane had to admit, watching the range crew finish rigging the rail, a fair test. It was also very obviously designed to fail her, built by a man who had spent a career reading firing solutions and understood exactly how much harder it was to solve a moving target at 900 meters than a static one at 4. Falk found her in the equipment tent an hour before the trial, checked her rifle's bore for the 3rd time without being asked, and did not offer her any encouragement, because he knew her well enough by then to know encouragement would only make the shaking worse. "Wind's out of the northwest today," he said instead. "Harder than yesterday. You'll want to hold higher than instinct tells you." "I know the wind, Chief." "I know you know the wind. I'm talking so you don't have to listen to your own head for a minute." He closed the rifle's action with a soft click and handed it back to her. 900 meters on a moving target is a hard shot. It is not an impossible shot. Your grandmother made harder ones with worse glass than what you're carrying, in the middle of a war, without 40 officers writing down whether she flinched. Grand Marshal Ilkar presided over the second trial from the same box, her crest held flat with the same visible discipline, and when the reactive target began its traverse, 60 meters of lateral movement in either direction, unpredictable in timing, ringed with decoy emitters spitting false signatures into the desert air like a swarm of something trying to be seen, Sloane understood that Thale had built her a problem with no clean textbook solution. She would have to read the target's motion the way she read wind, by feel and pattern rather than by any fixed number, with 900 meters and one working round to prove it wasn't luck. She did not fire on the first pass or the second. Thale's mouth had begun to compose itself into something satisfied by the third, watching the second stretch, watching what he clearly read as hesitation curdling into failure in front of the panel. It was not hesitation. It was the held moment, stretched longer than she had ever needed to stretch it, waiting for the traverse to complete its third full pass and begin the fourth. Because by the fourth pass she had the target's pattern in her hands the way she had wind in her hands, an unpredictable thing that nonetheless obeyed rules if a person watched it long enough. She fired on the fourth pass, into the space where the target would be a half-second after the round arrived, through a haze of decoy emissions that meant nothing to a slug that had never once cared what the veil thought it was looking at, and the round found the housing dead center for the second time in 2 days. The decoy field did nothing. It had never been able to do anything, because the emitters were built to confuse a sensor trying to read a threat signature, and Sloane's rifle had no signature for anything to confuse. Thale's harder test had, if anything, proven the point more thoroughly than the first one had, and this time there was no honor round asterisk to hang a dismissal on. The trial had been his own design, run under his own procedural authority, witnessed by the same 40 officers twice. He said nothing on the range floor that day. He did not need to. Sloane watched him turn and walk back toward the directorate offices with his crest locked flat, and his stride just slightly too fast to be unhurried, and understood, watching him go, that a man who could not win by making the test harder would eventually stop trying to win by testing at all. He tried one thing before he tried the report. That evening, a message arrived at the Saul Marksman Detachment's billet, routed through proper channels and phrased with scrupulous correctness, informing Chief Gunnery Sergeant Falk that his continued certification to maintain non-standard heritage ordnance was under administrative review pending a compliance audit of his armory's record-keeping. An audit that, as far as either of them could determine after an anxious night spent combing through 30 years of logs, had no actual basis in any irregularity, and existed for the sole purpose of reminding 2 people who had just embarrassed the Ordnance Directorate twice in 2 days exactly how many small, procedural levers a man in Thale's position still had left to pull. Falk did not lose his certification. The audit closed a month later with no findings, quietly, the way these things always closed when the findings had never been the point. But Sloane understood, reading the notice over his shoulder in the equipment tent, that it had never been meant to end his career. It had been meant to teach her the shape of a fight she had not yet realized she was in, one that would not be settled on a firing line, no matter how many times she proved herself there, because a man who could not win on the range would simply move the fight somewhere he still controlled the terrain. 3 days later, the Directorate's report cleared the Vale unit of any defect, and found instead an irregularity in the honor round's construction. An alloy variance, the document said, consistent with an improperly certified reload, consistent with tampering, consistent with a result that could not be considered representative of standard Concord ordnance performance under sanctioned conditions. It was 4 pages of technical language built to mean exactly one thing: the shot didn't count. Sloane read it twice in the armory at Camp Solace, the human auxiliary billet carved into a converted mining tunnel on the edge of Concord Fleet Yard 7, and then she set it down on the workbench next to Chief Gunnery Sergeant Emery Falk's elbow. Falk was 61 years old, had spent 30 of those years as an armorer in 3 different wars, human and otherwise, and had hands that shook faintly now unless they were holding a tool. He picked the report up, read it once, and set it back down with the particular gentleness of a man who wanted to throw something. "Alloy variants," he said. "I built that round myself, cast the slug, weighed the charge, sealed the casing. There's no variance in it because there's no factory line to vary from. It's handmade, same as it's been for 80 years, same as every round your grandmother ever fired." He looked at her. "They know that. This isn't a report. It's a door closing." They ran it twice. 900 meters, a moving target, decoys stacked on top of it. There's no honest reading of that data that gets you. Improperly certified reload. Honest was never the requirement, Corporal. Defensible was the requirement. 4 pages of technical language, signed by 2 directorate metallurgists who will never have to explain themselves to anyone outside their own chain of command, is defensible. It doesn't have to survive an argument. It only has to survive not being argued with, and most reports like this one never are. He set the pages down flat, squared the corners with more care than the gesture needed, the kind of small, precise motion she'd noticed he fell into whenever he was working hard not to let his hands do something else. That's the whole trick of it. Nobody has to believe the report. They just have to be tired enough, or busy enough, or careful enough about their own career to let it stand unchallenged. Then we ask for a retrial. You don't get to ask, Corporal, not from where you're standing. Falk rubbed a thumb along the worn brass plate on the Meridian rifle stock, a gesture she recognized because she'd caught herself doing the same thing 100 times. Thale doesn't want a retrial. He wants this filed and forgotten before the exemption committee meets next month, because if it's still an open question when they meet, he loses the standardization contract he's been building for 2 years. You put a hole in his procurement pipeline in front of 40 witnesses. He's not going to give you a second shot at making it permanent. She had thought, standing on that firing line, that the hardest part would be the shot. She understood now, 3 days later, reading a report built to unhappen the truth in front of her, that the hardest part was always going to be everything after the shot. "Then I need someone who was on that tier," she said, "to say what they actually saw." Falk was quiet for a long moment. Outside the armory, the tunnel's ventilation hummed the low double note that Concord infrastructure always seemed to carry, a sound she'd stopped noticing years ago and now, standing in the middle of the fight of her life, heard again like it was new. "There's one," he said finally. "But she's not going to owe you anything for asking, and if you're wrong about what she saw, she's going to end your career instead of Thale's." Grand Marshal Vesa Ilkar had not slept well in 6 days, and it had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the shape of the problem sitting on her desk. She had commanded the Concord's 11th Battle Group for 19 years before her promotion to the Proving Grounds Command, had stood the bridge through the Halyard Reach engagements and the long grinding border war against the Kursk remnant fleets, and in all of it, she had never once seen a projectile weapon defeat an interdiction veil in a sanctioned trial. The veil doctrine was not a policy position to her. It was the reason her ships came home. 40 years of combat data said the doctrine worked, and the doctrine had worked. Every single time it had been tested against everything the Concord's enemies had ever fielded. It had not been tested, she now understood, against a weapon with nothing to predict. She had watched the recovered footage 11 times. She had run the Veil unit sensor logs herself, alone, after the Directorate's own technicians went home for the night, and found what she had already suspected she would find. The interception grid had not failed to fire. It had failed to arm because nothing in 400 meters of desert air had presented a signature worth arming against. The round had no guidance emissions, no charge bloom, no terminal correction burn. To the Veil, it had not looked like an attack. It had looked like nothing at all, right up until it wasn't. That was not sabotage. That was a hole in 40 years of doctrine, wide enough to drive a war through. She had said nothing of this to Thale, because Thale's report had already gone out under his authority and hers jointly, per Proving Grounds protocol, and she had signed it without reading it closely enough, 3 days ago, in the crush of a review cycle that had 100 other fires burning. She understood now that this had been a mistake, and she had commanded battle groups long enough to know that the correction for a mistake was never to compound it by pretending it hadn't happened. The door signal chimed. She had been expecting it, in the vague way a commander expects the consequence of an unresolved problem to eventually walk through a door. Enter. Corporal Sloane Duran came to attention just inside the threshold, rifle slung, uniform correct in every particular, and said nothing, which Ilkar respected more than she expected to. Most junior officers filled silence the moment they were nervous. This one let it sit. "You did not request this meeting through channels," Ilkar said. "No, Marshal. I was told you wouldn't grant it through channels." "You were told correctly." Ilkar gestured to the chair across from her desk, an unusual courtesy, and watched the human take it with the same economy of motion she'd shown on the firing line. "Tell me why you're here, Corporal, and be aware that I have already read the Directorate's report, and I already know it is not an honest document." Something moved behind Sloane's eyes, not surprise exactly. Relief banked hard behind discipline. "Then you know my round wasn't tampered with." "I know your round was unremarkable. That is not the same claim your Under-Marshal made, and it is the more damning one." Ilkar rose, crossed to the window that looked out over the Anvil Range, dark now under 2 moons. "I have commanded warships through the Halyard Reach for 19 years, Corporal. I have watched the Veil stop everything the Kursk have ever thrown at my hull. I built my career on the doctrine your rifle just walked through like it wasn't there. Do you understand what you are asking me to reconsider?" "I'm not asking you to reconsider anything, Marshal. I'm asking for a second sanctioned trial, under proper observation. No honor round, no ceremony, whatever conditions you set." "And if the result repeats?" Sloane held her stare. "Then it isn't a fluke, it's a gap, and somebody who wants my people dead is going to find it whether the Concord admits it exists or not." Ilkar had spent 19 years learning to read the difference between a subordinate telling her what she wanted to hear and a subordinate telling her something true and inconvenient. This was the second kind. She had built her whole career on being the officer who could tell the difference, and she was not about to stop trusting that instinct now, because the truth happened to be uncomfortable. "There is a listening post on the Halyard border," she said, turning from the window. "Sentinel Relay 9. Kursk raider activity has been increasing in that sector for 6 weeks, salvage runs mostly, but the last 3 engagements show something new. Shielded personal armor on the raiding parties. Concord pattern interdiction technology, badly maintained, almost certainly stolen or reverse-engineered from a Directorate salvage contract that should never have left secure storage." She let that sit a moment, watching it land. "I was going to reinforce the relay with a standard Concord garrison rotation next week. I am reconsidering the composition of that garrison." "You want to send my detachment instead?" "I want to send your detachment alongside a standard garrison, under live conditions, where the result cannot be attributed to a controlled range and a favorable wind." Ilkar's crest lay flat, deliberately, an effort of Will Sloane was beginning to recognize as the tell of a woman keeping her own hope in check. "If your weapon performs the way it performed on my range, against real shielded hostiles, in a real engagement, then I will have grounds to reopen the exemption question with evidence Under-Marshal Thale cannot dismiss with a report." She paused. "If it fails, Corporal, people die because I sent you there to prove a point, and I will not be able to protect you or your detachment from what follows." "I understand the terms." "I don't think you do yet. Sentinel Relay 9 has 11 residents and a garrison of 40. If the Kursk overrun it while I am running an experiment, that is 41 names I will carry for the rest of my career." Ilkar sat back down, folded her hands, and for the first time since Sloane had entered the room, let her crest rise, just slightly, an admission she was making on purpose. "I'm not doing this to prove your rifle works, Corporal. I am doing this because I have found a hole in my own doctrine, and I would rather find the bottom of it under conditions I choose than wait for the Kursk to find it for me." "And if I say no?" Sloane asked, because she had learned, growing up in a house full of her mother's careful silences, that the questions worth asking were usually the ones nobody wanted to hear out loud. "If I tell you the range trial is enough, and I'd rather not gamble 41 lives to satisfy a directorate report. Then I reinforce Sentinel Relay 9 with a standard garrison rotation next week regardless, because the raider activity in that sector doesn't wait on either of our comfort, and Under-Marshal Thale's fraudulent report stands unchallenged in the official record until the next incident forces the issue, at a time and a cost neither of us gets to choose." Ilkar did not soften that either. "I'm not telling you there's a version of this where nobody bears risk, Corporal. I am telling you there's a version where the risk is at least informed by the truth, and a version where it isn't. You may say no. I would not hold it against you if you did. But I would ask you to consider what happens to the next Corvin Isk, on the next relay, the next time nobody with the authority to fix it was willing to look at the problem honestly." Sloane thought of her grandmother's journal, of a ridge on a continent she'd never see, of 6 hours a retreating column had needed and gotten because one woman had refused to be anywhere except exactly where she was most needed. She thought that a straight answer, however uncomfortable, had always seemed to her a fairer thing to build a life around than a comfortable one. "I'll go," she said, "but I want Falk on the rotation too. If we're doing this honestly, I want the one person who can keep both weapon systems running at once, standing next to me when it counts." "Granted," Ilkar made a note, and for just a moment something that was not quite a smile crossed her face, gone before it could properly be called one. "You argue like a commander already, Corporal, whether the rank reflects it yet or not." Sloane stood. Before she signed the deployment order, Ilkar called for her fleet's chief sensor analyst, a meticulous, soft-spoken Thren named Dr. Yevrin Cass, who had spent 11 years modeling interdiction shield performance, and who received the request to explain, in plain terms, why the doctrine he had helped build might have a hole in it, with the particular unhappiness of a man being asked to audit his own life's work. He ran the Anvil trial data 3 times before he would commit to a conclusion out loud, and when he finally did, standing in her office with a data slate in his hands like it might bite him, he did not soften it. "The veil doesn't fail against Corporal Duran's weapon, Marshal. It never engages in the first place. Our intercept architecture treats the absence of a detectable signature as the absence of a threat, because for 40 years that assumption has been safe. Every guided round broadcasts terminal correction. Every energy weapon broadcasts a charge bloom. We built 4 decades of doctrine on the belief that a weapon capable of killing a shielded target would necessarily also be a weapon our sensors could see coming." He set the slate down. "A rifle that solves its firing solution entirely in advance, with no correction after the round leaves the barrel, doesn't fit anywhere in that architecture. It isn't stealthy, in any sense our doctrine has a category for. It's simply older than the assumption. Can the veil be modified to detect it? Given enough lead time, probably. A pure ballistic arc has its own signature, if you know to look for the absence of the signatures you usually look for, but that requires redesigning detection logic around a category of threat the Directorate has spent 40 years telling procurement boards doesn't exist anymore." Cass's crest gave the smallest possible flicker, the Thren equivalent. Ilkar had come to understand over years of working with him, of a shrug. "I would need 18 months and a research budget nobody has approved. In the meantime, Marshal, any adversary who works this out independently owns a weapon our entire fleet cannot currently see." That was the sentence that decided her, more than the footage, more than Corporal Duran's steady voice across her desk 2 days later. Not the fact that a corporal's heirloom rifle had embarrassed a directorate officer in front of a review board. Commanders who let embarrassment set doctrine did not keep commands for 19 years. But the plain, unglamorous fact that somewhere out past the halyard reach, an adversary with far less to lose than the conquered might stumble onto the same gap by accident. The way Sloane's own grandmother's war had stumbled onto it 2 centuries before any of them had a name for interdiction shielding at all. When do we deploy? 4 days. And Corporal, say nothing of this conversation to Under-Marshal Thale. He retains procedural authority over Directorate Ordnance allocation for this deployment, per standing regulation, whether I like it or not. I intend to use that against him, not around him. Let him make his own mistake in the open. It took Sloane a moment to understand what the Grand Marshal meant by that, and when she did, she felt something colder than fear settle into her stomach, because she understood exactly what shape Thale's mistake was going to take, and exactly who was going to have to survive it. Under-Marshal Ossen Thale received the deployment orders for Sentinel Relay 9 with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had just been handed a second chance to close a door he'd thought was already shut. Standing garrison rotation orders were, by regulation, his to configure for ordnance loadout, and he configured them with care. The Saul Marksman Detachment would deploy to the relay as part of the reinforcement package, Ilkar's decision, not his, and one he intended to make regret itself before the rotation was a week old. Standard Concord ordnance for the full garrison, per the transition timeline the exemption committee had already all but ratified in preliminary session. No exceptions for heritage arms during an active operational deployment, per the same protocol that had governed every Concord unit for 40 years. It was, on its face, an entirely defensible order. It was also, Thale understood with some private pleasure, going to strip Corporal Duran of the one weapon that had embarrassed him in front of the entire Directorate Review Board, and it was going to do it through channels so clean nobody could later claim he'd acted out of spite. He signed the loadout manifest himself. Legacy arms surrendered to quartermaster stores prior to embarkation. Standard Concord rifles issued in their place, full complement, no exceptions. He did not attend the embarkation. He did not need to. He had already won. Sentinel Relay 9 sat on a wind-scoured shelf of rock on the inward face of a border moon, the Concord charts called Corval's Reach, close enough to the halyard border that on a clear night the relay's civilian residents, 11 of them, 3 families who'd staked survey claims before the border ever mattered, could see the running lights of Kursk salvage ships crawling along the debris field of an old battle nobody living remembered the name of. Sloane stood on the relay's outer catwalk on the second night of the rotation, with a standard-issue Concord rifle slung across her back, feeling its unfamiliar balance the way a person feels an ill-fitting boot, and understood for the first time in her career exactly how much of her competence lived inside a specific piece of walnut and steel that was, at that moment, sitting in a quartermaster's crate 400 kilometers away. "You look like you're carrying someone else's arm," said Falk, coming up beside her. He'd volunteered for the rotation the moment he heard Thale's manifest, on the grounds, accurate, as it turned out, that a garrison running heritage pattern maintenance protocols alongside standard Concord ordnance needed an armorer who could service both, and he was the only one on Fleet Yard 7 qualified for the older systems. "It's a good rifle," Sloane said, which was true and also entirely beside the point. "It's the rifle everyone else here already knows how to use," Falk said. "That's the problem, isn't it? Not that it's bad, that it's the same as theirs, same signature, same predictable arc, same everything the Veil already knows how to read." He looked out at the debris field, the slow crawl of distant lights. "Thale didn't strip your weapon because he thinks it's junk, Corporal. He stripped it because he's terrified it isn't. Below them, on the lower catwalk, a young Thren garrison soldier was running a last check on the access ramp's point defense mounts, moving with the careful, over-precise diligence of someone who had graduated cadet training recently enough to still believe precision was the same thing as safety. Sloane had spoken to him twice since embarkation. Corvin Isk, 3 months out of the Directorate Academy, assigned to Sentinel Relay 9 as his first posting, the kind of earnest young soldier who asked more questions than his instructors probably appreciated and wrote down every answer like it might be tested later. He asked me yesterday why I still carry the long gun when the Concord rifle does everything it does and more, Sloane said. I didn't have a good answer for him. Told him I'd let him know if I ever worked one out. Good answers to that question are rarer than you'd think, Falk said. Most people who carry the old pattern couldn't tell you why either, past the fact that it's theirs. That's not nothing, Corporal. But it isn't an argument, and Thale knows the difference even if half this garrison doesn't. She did not answer, because the alarm cut across the relay's public address a half-second later. 3 short tones and a voice speaking Thren-accented Concord, standard with the flat calm of someone reading off a checklist under enormous strain. Unshielded contacts, multiple, bearing 310, closing. The course came out of the debris field in 6 low, fast-rating skiffs, running dark until they were almost on top of the relay's perimeter sensors, and the garrison's first response was, by every metric that mattered, textbook. Standard interdiction shields snapped up along the relay's outer wall. Point defense turrets tracked the incoming skiffs, computed intercept solutions, and began firing coil-charged rounds designed to punch through raider hull plating at a range the Kursk had clearly planned for, because the skiffs peeled apart into a dispersed attack pattern the instant the turrets opened up, and 11 armored raiders in shielded personal suits hit the relay's lower access ramp before the garrison had finished retasking. Sloane watched the first exchange from the catwalk and felt the same cold drop in her stomach she'd felt reading Thale's report, because she recognized the shape of what was happening even before the comms confirmed it. Contact reports weapon fire ineffective, the garrison net crackled. Repeat, standard rounds ineffective against raider personal shielding. There, the voice cut off into static and gunfire. The Kursk shields were crude, salvaged, badly tuned Concord pattern interdiction technology exactly as Ilkar had warned, but crude and badly tuned did not mean non-functional. They read the guidance signature off every coil-charged Concord round the garrison fired and answered it, again and again, a half-second ahead every time, the same prophecy Thale had described on the Anvil range, working exactly as designed against exactly the weapon it was designed to defeat. 11 raiders came up the access ramp into a hail of standard Concord fire and kept walking, unscratched, while 3 garrison soldiers went down under return fire that had no such trouble finding them. Falk, Sloane was already moving, boots hammering the catwalk grating toward the armory access hatch. Where's the crate? Quartermaster Store's lower deck, past the ramp they're already climbing. Falk was right behind her, breathing hard, his 61-year-old knees taking the stairs 2 at a time anyway. Corporal, that's inside the breach. Then we go through it. They did not go through it cleanly. The lower corridor was full of smoke and the strobing blue flare of shields eating rounds that shouldn't have been able to touch them. And a young Thren garrison soldier named Corvin Isk was down against the bulkhead with a wound in his side and his standard rifle empty beside him, having done everything the doctrine told him to do and having watched it do nothing at all. Cover him, Sloane snapped at Falk, and kept moving, because the crate was 30 meters further and 30 meters was the difference between a garrison that held and a garrison that didn't. She found the quartermaster stores unguarded. The 2 soldiers assigned there had gone forward to the breach when the alarm sounded, which was brave, and which meant the crate sat exactly where the manifest said it would, sealed, Concord regulation stamp across the lid. The words Legacy Arms, hold pending transport, stenciled in Thale's own procurement code. She broke the seal with the flat of her boot heel, and had the Meridian rifle in her hands inside 4 seconds, the balance of it settling into her palms like the last 3 days of carrying someone else's arm had never happened. She loaded from the box of hand-cast rounds Falk had insisted on packing against every regulation on the manifest, and went back toward the breach at a dead run. The corridor when she reached it was worse than she'd left it. 6 raiders had pushed past the initial defensive line, shields flaring blue-white with every round the garrison threw at them, advancing on the relay's central junction, where the 11 civilian residents had been moved for shelter behind a bulkhead door that would not hold against a raiding party with unopposed access. Corvin Isk was still down. Falk crouched over him, applying a field dressing with hands that had gone steady the instant they had a task to do. And past them, in the open junction, a Kursk raider in scavenged Concord pattern armor was 3 meters from the shelter door and closing. Sloane dropped to one knee in the corridor mouth, found the raider through the Meridian rifle's unpowered scope. No readout, no lock, nothing but glass in her own eye and a lifetime of learning to read a shot the hard way, and fired. The round crossed 11 meters of smoke-hazed air with no charge signature, no guidance emission, nothing for the raider's stolen shield to taste before it was already through the faceplate. The raider went down without the shield ever flickering, because as far as the shield's crude prediction logic could tell, nothing had happened. Nothing had been fired. There had simply, suddenly, been a hole where a person used to be. The 5 raiders behind him did not understand what they were looking at any better than the shield had. Sloane worked the bolt, found the next target, fired again, and a second raider dropped mid-stride with the same impossible suddenness. And this time the one still standing understood enough to be afraid, which was its own kind of weapon. Behind the bulkhead door, close enough that Sloane could hear it even through armor plate and the ringing in her own ears, a child was crying in the particular high, exhausted register of someone who had been crying for longer than any child should have to. One of the 3 families who'd staked survey claims on Corval's Reach before the border ever mattered. A mining engineer named Priya Osai and her 2 children, the youngest not yet 4, had been herded into the shelter with the rest of the residents at the first alarm, and it was Priya's voice, low and steady even through the door, that Sloane could hear now, telling her daughter a story about nothing in particular. The way people do when the only thing left to give a frightened child is the sound of a calm voice that has decided, whatever else is true, not to sound frightened itself. Sloane held that sound in her chest for exactly as long as it took to work the bolt again, and then set it aside, because the shelter door held only as long as the junction in front of it did, and the junction was not yet secure. Fall back to the relay line. Someone was shouting on the garrison net, and to Sloane's ear it sounded like an order finally starting to make sense of what it was watching. Non-standard weapons effective. Repeat, non-standard weapons. She fired a 3rd time and a 4th, working the bolt with the same unhurried rhythm her grandmother's journal described in handwriting gone brown with age. The held moment, the space between heartbeats, and around her the garrison's standard rifles kept up their useless hammering against shields that shrugged off every round because those rounds were exactly the threat 40 years of doctrine had trained the shields to see. It was her rifle, alone in that corridor, that the Kursk had no answer for, because it was the one weapon in the fight that had never been part of the war the shields were built to fight. The raiders still standing broke for the access ramp, and for a moment it looked like the junction might hold, until the relay's outer hull rang with an impact that had nothing to do with small arms, and the deck tilted 3 degrees under Sloane's boots as something considerably larger than a raiding skiff took up station directly above the shelter dome. Gunship. The voice on the garrison net had gone thin with a fear that had nothing to do with training. They've got a shielded gunship on the dome. It's cutting through the outer plating. We cannot get a targeting solution. Point defense can't. The transmission dissolved into static and a second impact. Closer. The whole relay groaning around it like something alive taking a wound. Sloane went up the maintenance ladder to the dome's observation blister 2 rungs at a time. Falk's voice chasing her from below, "Stay with the wounded." "That's an order, Corporal," and did not stop, because 11 residents and the rest of the garrison were sitting under a dome that a shielded gunship was patiently, methodically cutting a hole through, and the only person on Sentinel Relay 9 who had ever put a round through that particular kind of shielding was climbing toward it right now. The gunship hung 60 meters off the dome's exterior, a squat raider hull wrapped in the same salvaged shimmer that had swallowed every standard round the garrison had thrown at it all night. A cutting beam walking a slow, deliberate line across reinforced plating 2 decks below the shelter. It was not a fast target. It did not need to be. It had already won the engagement in every sense that mattered, and was simply taking the time its shield bought it to finish the job properly. The observation blister put her at just over 1,100 meters from the gunship's hull, further than she had ever fired at anything that could fire back, in wind that had picked up out of the northwest, exactly the way Falk had warned her it would that morning, in light gone strange and blue-white from the cutting beam's glare reflecting off the dome's outer plating. There was no honor round here, no panel of officers to witness it, no procedural stay of execution waiting on the other side of a miss. There was a dome full of people and a working rifle in the held moment, stretched out longer than she had ever needed to stretch it, because at 1,100 meters, even a heartbeat's worth of error put the round a body's width from where it needed to be. She found the hull seam where the cutting beam's power conduit ran, the one weak point on a shielded gunship that no amount of interdiction technology could armor without shutting down the weapon it fed, because Falk had drilled that seam into her during 100 hours of range time on data sheets neither of them had ever expected to matter outside a classroom, and she held the held moment until the wind eased its gust by half a degree and fired. At 1,100 meters, the round took just over a second and a half to arrive, long enough that she watched the whole flight of it in a way she never had at 400, long enough to understand, watching, exactly how much of marksmanship was patience, and exactly how little of it was luck. It went through the seam clean, found the conduit behind it, and the gunship's cutting beam died in a shower of sparks a half-second before its shield failed entirely, and the whole hull began slowly to list. The gunship broke off, venting atmosphere from a hull breach it could not spare the power to seal, and turned back toward the debris field, trailing the same defeated retreat its raiding skiffs had already begun below. By the time Sloane came back down the ladder, the corridor had gone quiet in the particular way a battlefield goes quiet only after it has actually ended. The raiding party broke off 11 minutes after the first contact alarm, 3 of their number down and their skiffs already retreating across the debris field, and the cost the relay paid for those 11 minutes sat on the deck of the lower corridor when the smoke cleared. 4 garrison wounded, 2 civilians with minor injuries from a collapsed shelter panel, and Corvin Isk, 22 years old, 3 months out of Directorate cadet training, who had followed every rule the Concord had ever taught him and died of a wound he'd taken standing his post with a rifle that could not touch what was killing him, 40 minutes before his own commanding officer's decision, put a working weapon back into a soldier's hands. Sloane knelt beside him afterward, in the wreck of the corridor, with Falk's hand hard on her shoulder and the Meridian rifle still warm against her leg, and did not have words for what she felt, because there weren't any that fit a young man who had done everything right and been failed by the doctrine that told him what right looked like. Grand Marshal Vesa Ilkar received the after-action report from Sentinel Relay 9 at 300 ship time, and read it standing, because sitting down felt like it would take something from the reading that the reading deserved to keep. 11 minutes of engagement, 6 raiding skiffs, 3 destroyed on retreat by relay point defense once the attack pattern was understood. 11 boarding raiders, 5 confirmed casualties inflicted, all 5 by non-standard heritage ordnance. Standard Concord small arms confirmed ineffective against salvaged interdiction shielding in all documented engagements. 4 garrison wounded, 2 civilian injuries minor. 1 garrison fatality. Cadet Corvin Isk, 22, Directorate Service record clean. Commendation pending for holding the forward junction alone for the 90 seconds it took reinforcement to arrive. She had commanded fleets. She had signed condolence letters before, more of them than she wanted to remember, and she had never once let herself believe that any of them got easier, because the day they got easier was the day she'd stopped being fit to send anyone anywhere. But this one sat differently, because this one she could trace, line by line, all the way back to a signature on a loadout manifest that had stripped a working weapon out of a garrison's hands 3 days before it needed it, in service of a doctrine she herself had spent 6 days quietly deciding was wrong. She called Sentinel Relay 9 directly before the sun rose over Fleet Yard 7, against the advice of her own staff, who felt a Grand Marshal's personal attention to a single frontier garrison was disproportionate to the incident's scale. She did not agree that it was disproportionate. She spoke first to the relay's ranking survivor, a young quartermaster sergeant whose voice was still hoarse from smoke, and then briefly to Chief Gunnery Sergeant Falk, who told her plainly, without softening it for her rank, that the boy had held that junction alone for the 90 seconds the report credited him for. With an empty rifle in his hands, he hadn't been able to reload in time, because the raiders kept coming and he had refused to fall back and leave the shelter door uncovered. He had done exactly what the Concord trained him to do. The Concord's own equipment was the reason it hadn't been enough. Last, she asked to speak with Corporal Duran, and was told the corporal was still in the lower corridor, and had been for some hours, and had not yet said anything to anyone that the sergeant had been able to make out. Ilkar did not press for the connection. There were things a commander owed a subordinate in the immediate aftermath of a death that outranked even a Grand Marshal's need for a first-hand account, and the space to grieve without an audience was one of them. She sat with that call for a long time after it ended, turning over a decision she had already effectively made, and now simply needed to find the nerve to make formally, in front of a room that included the man who had caused it. 19 years of command had taught her that the hardest orders were rarely the ones with an unclear answer. They were the ones where the answer was obvious, and the cost of acting on it was going to be paid by people who had already paid enough. She did not sleep. At 600 she called for Under-Marshal Ossen Thale, and for a full review board, and for Corporal Sloane Duran, and set the meeting for the same conference deck, where the Anvil Proving Grounds review had taken place 2 weeks before, because she wanted every officer who had stood on that tier and watched a rifle they dismissed put a hole through 40 years of certainty to be in the room when the doctrine finished dying. Thale arrived composed, which told her he had already read the after-action report and had already built an argument around it, because Thale never arrived anywhere without an argument built. He took his seat across the table from her with his crest deliberately, visibly flat, and waited for her to speak first, which was itself a kind of opening move. Under-Marshal, Ilkar said, explain the loadout manifest for the Sentinel Relay 9 rotation. Standard procedure. Legacy arms are not authorized for active operational deployment absent a specific exemption ruling, and the exemption ruling was pending review at the time the rotation embarked. I acted within regulation. You acted within the letter of a regulation you had personal cause to enforce narrowly 3 days after that same regulation's spirit was called into direct question by a demonstrated weapons doctrine failure, and you did so without informing this board that the failure had occurred. Ilkar set the after-action report on the table between them, did not slide it toward him, simply let it sit there as a fact in the room. Cadet Isk's rifle failed him, not through any error of his own. It failed him because it was the exact weapon a hostile shield system was built, over 40 years, specifically to defeat, And the one weapon on that relay capable of answering it was sitting in a sealed crate in your name, because you wanted a data point to disappear before the exemption committee could see it. That is a characterization, Marshal, not a finding. Then let the board make the finding. Ilkar turned to the assembled officers, the same 40 crests that had risen on the observation tier 2 weeks before, and found she did not need to raise her voice, because the room was already listening the way rooms listen when they know something has shifted under them and haven't yet decided how to stand on the new ground. I have run the Veil unit's sensor logs from both the Anvil trial and the Sentinel relay engagement. In both cases, the interdiction field failed to intercept a projectile that carried no guidance emission, no charge signature, and no terminal correction burn. The 3 data classes the Veil's predictive architecture has been built around for 4 decades, because for 4 decades, no combatant fielded against the Concord has used anything else. Corporal Duran's rifle is not a superior weapon in any conventional sense. It is slower, shorter ranged, and lower in rate of fire than standard issue. It is also, as of 2 weeks ago, the only weapon in this fleet's inventory that our own interdiction doctrine cannot see coming. She let that sit in the room for a long moment. That is not a curiosity, Under-Marshal. That is the largest gap in Concord defensive doctrine since the Veil was fielded, and it very nearly cost this fleet a listening post and 41 lives because you buried the first evidence of it under a fraudulent tampering finding to protect a procurement contract. I am not asking this board to rule on Corporal Duran's rifle today. I am asking this board to rule on whether an officer who suppressed a known combat-relevant weakness for personal advancement retains the authority to configure this fleet's ordnance doctrine going forward. Thale's crest rose then, finally, all the way, the tell he had spent 2 weeks fighting down going up in front of 40 officers at the exact moment it mattered least to control it. And Sloane, sitting at the far end of the table where she had been asked to wait and say nothing until called upon, watched a man's career end in real time and felt no satisfaction in it at all, only a kind of tired grief that matched, in its way, the one she had carried out of that corridor 2 nights before. The contract, Thale said, and his double-tone voice had lost its chord, had collapsed down to something flat and singular, was never about personal advancement. It was about standardization, about a fleet that speaks one weapon's language instead of 40. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain interoperability across 19-member worlds' logistics chains? What happens to that interoperability if every world starts fielding its own legacy exemption, its own unpredictable arsenal? I have some idea, Ilkar said. I commanded the 11th Battle Group through the worst of the Halyard Reach, Under-Marshal, and I promise you I understand the cost of complexity better than a man who has spent his career in procurement offices. I also understand the cost of certainty, when the certainty is wrong. You built a fleet-wide doctrine on the assumption that every weapon worth fielding announces itself before it arrives. Corporal Duran's grandmother's rifle does not care what your doctrine assumes. Neither, I promise you, will the next enemy who works out what she worked out on my own proving range, in front of 40 witnesses, 2 weeks before you tried to erase the record of it. A fleet commodore near the table's midpoint, an older Thren named Orsa Vend who had sat through the Anvil trial without comment and had a reputation, Sloane had heard, for never voting with a room simply because the room had already decided which way to lean, cleared her throat in the particular way that meant she intended to be heard. Marshal, with respect, the doctrine question is sound, but I would have this board understand the scale of what is being proposed before it votes. We are not discussing one exemption for one detachment. If Dr. Cass's analysis holds, we are discussing a structural blind spot in every interdiction platform this fleet has fielded since before most officers in this room held a commission. That is not a policy adjustment. That is an admission that the Concord has spent 40 years vulnerable to a category of threat it told itself did not exist. "It is exactly that admission, Commodore," Ilkar said. "I would rather make it in this room, on my own authority, than have the Kursk, or someone considerably more capable than the Kursk, make it for us on a battlefield we don't choose." Vend held her gaze a moment longer, crest lifting fractionally, and then inclined her head. The small formal gesture Sloane had learned over the past weeks meant a mind had been changed rather than merely outvoted. "Then I would ask that the record show this board was not misled by ignorance, Marshal. It was misled by a man who understood the stakes perfectly and chose to bury them." Her eyes moved briefly to Thale and back. "I support the reassessment." Two more officers spoke after her, briefer, less pointed, but each one another crest tipping the same direction, and Sloane understood, watching it happen, that whatever came next for the legacy arms exemption, it would not be undone quietly by the next ambitious procurement officer who inherited Thale's office, because a room this size did not forget being shown, in the same afternoon, both a dead cadet service record and the report that had tried to erase the reason he died. She looked down the table. "Corporal Duran." Sloane stood. "Tell the board what you told me 4 days ago in my office. Why you asked for a second trial." "Because if it wasn't a fluke," Sloane said, "somebody who wanted my people dead was going to find the gap whether the Concord admitted it existed or not." She glanced once at the empty chair that had been set at the table's far end for a cadet service record nobody would fill in past this month. "They found it 2 nights ago. It found Cadet Isk first, because his rifle told a lie he had no way of knowing was a lie. I'd rather the whole fleet know the truth before the next one finds it the same way he did." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Ilkar let the silence hold, because she had learned, across 19 years of command, that some silences did more work in a room than any speech could, and this was one of them. "The legacy arms exemption is reinstated, effective immediately, without expiration, for any unit that demonstrates operational proficiency," she said finally. "Further, I am ordering a fleet-wide reassessment of interdiction shield doctrine, effective this quarter, and a standing directorate, independent of procurement authority, tasked with identifying and fielding non-signature weapons systems as a supplementary capability across every Concord combat platform. We have spent 40 years building a doctrine that assumes our enemies fight the way we do. Corporal Duran's rifle has demonstrated, at considerable cost, that this assumption was never safe to make." She looked at Thale. "Under-Marshal Thale is relieved of Ordnance Procurement Authority, effective immediately, pending full review of the Anvil Trial Report and the Sentinel Relay Loadout Manifest by Fleet Judiciary. This board is adjourned." Thale did not look at Sloane on his way out of the room. She had not expected him to. She had expected, somewhere in the part of her that had spent a career learning to read a shot before it was fired, that a man like that would find some way to make his exit about the injustice of it rather than the cost of it, and he did not disappoint her, muttering something about interoperability and precedent to an aide as the door closed behind him, already, she suspected, drafting the report that would explain why none of this had really been his fault. She did not think about him again for a long time after that. The reassessment Ilkar ordered took the better part of a year to reach every corner of the Concord's 19-member worlds, and it did not travel quietly. A fleet doctrine that had gone unquestioned for 4 decades does not get overturned by a single incident report, however damning, and Sloane spent a good part of that year in front of committees she had never expected to sit before, explaining, over and over, in language that got simpler and more patient with each retelling, what a held moment felt like. Why a bolt-action rifle with no processor behind the glass could do something no coil-charged smart weapon in the Concord arsenal had ever managed. She was not the only voice in that fight. Ilkar carried more of it than Sloane ever saw, in rooms Sloane was never invited into, spending political capital she had built across 19 years of command on a corporal from a species that had been Concord members for barely over a decade. But it was Sloane's rifle, and the after-action report with Corvin Isk's name in it, that kept getting produced, again and again. Whenever some committee member suggested the whole matter might be handled more quietly through a narrower policy adjustment. The worst of those committees, 4 months into the reassessment, was a joint logistics panel convened to argue that the Supplementary Capability Directorate was an unfunded mandate the fleet could not sustain, and its chair, a procurement liaison from a member world Sloane had never heard of before that morning, careful and unfailingly polite in the way of a man who had never once had to bury a body because of a decision he made, put the objection to her plainly. In front of a room considerably less inclined to be moved than the review board had been. "Corporal, I don't dispute your marksmanship. I dispute the premise that this fleet should build a permanent doctrine around one engagement. Militaries have always found single points of failure after the fact. That does not mean every single point of failure justifies a standing directorate, a training pipeline, a supply chain for ordnance most member worlds stopped manufacturing a century ago. Where does it end?" "It ends," Sloane said, "the day nobody in this fleet has to explain to a cadet's family why the rifle regulation put in his hands couldn't touch what was killing him. Until then, it doesn't end. It just gets more expensive to keep pretending it isn't a problem." She had said some version of that sentence a dozen times by then, to a dozen rooms, and had learned that the plain ones landed harder than the clever ones. "You're not being asked to believe me, sir. You're being asked to look at Dr. Cass's sensor logs and tell this panel they're wrong. Nobody's managed that yet." Nobody managed it that day either, though the panel took another 2 months to say so formally, and Sloane came to understand, across that stretch of committee rooms and technical hearings, that the fight to keep a truth on the record was rarely as clean or as fast as the fight that had first uncovered it. Falk told her once, over a workbench at Camp Solace on a night she'd come home too tired to eat, that this part, the slow part, the unglamorous part, the part with no held moment and no clean shot, was the part her grandmother's generation had understood better than anyone. That surviving the battle and surviving the argument afterward were two entirely different disciplines, and a soldier who only trained for the first one usually lost the second. By the time the reassessment concluded, 6 other member worlds had opened their own legacy arms archives, dusting off weapons systems their militaries had shelved a generation or 2 before joining the Concord, testing them against interdiction shielding under ILCAR's new Supplementary Capability Directorate, and finding, world after world, some version of the same gap. A hand-thrown weighted blade from a heavy-gravity world that carried no emission signature at all. A chemically propelled dart system from a species whose ancestors had hunted with them for 10,000 years before ever building a starship. A Thren ceremonial crossbow, retired from military use 3 centuries earlier as primitive, that turned out to put a bolt through a standard interdiction veil almost as cleanly as Sloane's grandmother's rifle had. None of it replaced Concord standard ordnance. All of it, by the end of that year, sat in a supplementary loadout roster that every Concord combat unit was required to carry a minimum working proficiency in, because the fleet that had spent 40 years assuming its enemies fought the way it did had finally, expensively, learned not to assume that again. ILCAR signed the final reassessment order herself, on a morning 14 months after the Sentinel relay engagement, and had it distributed not just across the Concord's own forces, but, through the slow formal channels of interstellar diplomacy, to every allied and neutral power the Concord maintained contact with, because a defensive gap that wide, once known, could not responsibly be kept secret from anyone the Concord might one day need to fight beside instead of merely for. The document that reached the wider galaxy that year did not use Sloane's name. It used a technical designation, non-signature kinetic countermeasure protocols, and a data set and a single line buried in an appendix, crediting the findings' origin to a proving ground trial and a subsequent field engagement involving Terran auxiliary personnel. It was enough. Militaries that had never heard of Earth, in systems the Concord had not yet mapped, began quietly reopening their own museums, their own retired arsenals, their own grandmothers' rifles, because doctrine, once it is shown to have a hole in it, does not stay comfortable anywhere it has traveled. Ilkar received, over the following months, a steady trickle of formal inquiries from outside the Concord entirely, neutral powers, border cultures, two governments the fleet had never so much as exchanged an ambassador with, each one asking, in its own careful diplomatic phrasing, for the technical appendix behind the line about non-signature kinetic countermeasure protocols. She authorized the release of the unclassified summary to all of them, over directorate objections that the data represented a strategic advantage worth guarding rather than sharing, because she had spent a career learning what happened to doctrines nobody was allowed to question, and she was not interested in building a second one just because the first had finally been fixed. One of those inquiries came, 8 months after the reassessment order, from a modest survey delegation representing a coalition of independent systems well beyond the Halyard reach, whose senior attaché, an unhurried, formally spoken woman with none of Thale's polish and all of Ven's patience, spent 3 days at the Anvil Proving Grounds watching the Supplementary Capability Directorate run its evaluation trials, and asked, on her final afternoon, to meet the corporal whose name kept appearing, uncredited, in the footnotes of every briefing she'd been given. "We have our own version of your rifle," the attaché told Sloane, standing at the edge of the same range where the Veil had first failed to see a threat coming, buried in a storehouse nobody's opened in 3 generations, because somebody decided a long time ago that anything without a targeting computer wasn't worth keeping. "I intend to have it opened when I go home." She studied the Meridian rifle a moment, the worn brass plate, the silver-gray grip. "It is a strange thing, to owe a debt to a weapon you have never fired." "It's not really the weapon," Sloane said. "It's remembering that somebody solved a problem once the hard way, before anybody had a computer to solve it for them. The weapon's just what's left over from the solving." The attaché considered that for a long moment, crestless in a way that made her expression harder to read than any Thren's, and then inclined her head in something that looked, across every difference of species and protocol between them, exactly like respect. Sloane thought of that exchange often, in the years that followed, whenever some new report crossed her desk describing a fleet or a border militia 3 systems away rediscovering, on its own, the same plain, unglamorous truth her grandmother had already known, that the wind doesn't care what year it is, and neither, in the end, does a doctrine that has finally been made to answer for what it forgot. Sloane read the final order in the camp's solace armory, standing at the same workbench where she had once set down a report built to unhappen the truth, and felt something in her chest ease that she had not realized was still clenched. "Congratulations," Falk said from the other end of the bench, where he was teaching a Thren cadet, young, careful-handed, a little too eager in the way young soldiers always were, how to seat a hand-loaded round without crushing the casing. "You broke a 40-year-old doctrine and started a museum renaissance across half the galaxy. How's it feel?" "It feels like it should have felt different," Sloane said. "It just feels like I did my job." "That's usually how the big ones feel from the inside." Falk nodded at the cadet, Corvin's cousin. "Requested the legacy program transfer 6 months ago. Wanted to learn the weapon that should have been in his hands the night he died." Sloane looked at the young Thren, Tovin Isk, 17 Concord Standard years old, his spinal crest lying flat with the particular effortful stillness of someone concentrating harder than his species' nervous system entirely wanted to allow, and thought of a corridor full of smoke, and a held moment that arrived 40 minutes too late to save the one person it might have mattered most for. "All right," she said, pulling a stool up to the bench and reaching for a rifle that was not her grandmother's but was built now to the same old pattern, walnut and hand-worked steel, and a scope with nothing behind the glass but a person's own patience. Let's start with the breathing. Everything else is just math, once you've got the breathing right. Tovin set his hands where she showed him, found the stock the way a person finds a thing they intend to be responsible for, and asked her, in the careful, formal Concord standard his generation had been raised speaking, why a weapon built before starflight should still matter to a fleet that could cross 100 light-years in a season. Because the fleet kept assuming the next fight would look like the last one, Sloane said. And somewhere out past the halyard reach, there's always somebody who never got the memo about what a modern weapon's supposed to look like. Your job is to be the one thing they didn't plan for. My cousin used to say the veil made us safe, Tovin said quietly, not looking up from the rifle. He believed that, right up until it didn't. I know. Sloane did not offer him anything easier than the truth, because she had learned across the past 14 months that cadets who trained on comforting lies made the same mistakes their instructors had. He wasn't wrong to believe his equipment, Tovin. That's not a character flaw. That's what training is supposed to give you. Trust that the tools in your hands will do what you were told they'd do. The failure wasn't his. It was every officer above him who let that trust get stretched further than it had ever been tested, because testing it honestly was inconvenient. She set her hand briefly on the stock beside his, not correcting his grip, just steadying it. The job now isn't to stop trusting your equipment. It's to make sure nobody ever gets to lie to you about what it can do again. That's the whole reason this bench exists. Tovin absorbed that in the unhurried way she'd come to recognize in him over 6 months of Tuesday and Thursday sessions, turning a thing over fully before deciding what to do with it, and then nodded once, and settled back into the stock the way she'd shown him, breathing the way she'd shown him, patient in a manner that had nothing to do with his species' nervous system, and everything to do with 6 months of a deliberately chosen discipline. She showed him the held moment, the space between heartbeats where the whole body goes still enough that the rifle stops being a separate thing from the person holding it, and watched him find it, clumsily at first and then, on the 4th try, not clumsily at all, the way she had found it once herself in a farmhouse that didn't exist anymore. In the grip of a rifle worn silver gray by 3 generations of hands that had never once needed a processor behind the glass to understand exactly what they were aiming at, and exactly why it still mattered. Later, after Tovin had gone back to the cadet barracks with a training rifle checked out properly under his own name for the first time, Sloane sat alone at the workbench with her grandmother's field journal open to the page she still knew by heart, the ink gone the color of old tea, the handwriting small and economical in the way of someone who had learned to waste nothing, not even words. The wind doesn't care what year it is. Only the shooter does. Beneath it, in the same hand, a line she had read 100 times without ever quite letting it land the way it landed now. A rifle is obsolete the day nobody left alive remembers what it's for, not the day something newer gets built. She thought of Ossen Thale, holding the Meridian rifle by 2 fingers on the anvil range 14 months and 1 lifetime ago, certain he was looking at a museum piece. She thought of Corvin Isk, 22 years old, who had never gotten the chance to learn what she now spent 2 evenings a week teaching a boy who shared half his name. She did not think either man had been wrong about everything. Thale had been right that the galaxy kept building newer things, faster things, weapons that thought for themselves, so the person holding them didn't have to. He had simply been wrong about what that made obsolete, and he had been wrong in exactly the way doctrines are always wrong, quietly, comfortably, for 40 years, until the day someone with nothing left to lose held still long enough to prove otherwise. She closed the journal, set it back in its case beside the rifle that would, eventually, belong to someone else's granddaughter, and went to find Falk, because there was a supply requisition for the next cadet intake that needed both their signatures, and the wind outside the armory had picked up out of the northwest, exactly the way it always did this time of year, and some habits, she had learned, were worth keeping simply because they still worked. somewhere above the Anvil Range, in an office with a window that looked out over a proving ground that no longer proved what it used to prove, Grand Marshal Vesa Ilkar filed the last of the year's reassessment paperwork and let her crest rise, finally, all the way, with no one left in the room who needed her to hold it still.